of you that are For those of you that are new here, I am Dana Rogozinski, and I am on the board of the Young Leadership Association. I am the book club chair for the American Society for Yad Vashem. I got involved in this organization about 4 years ago and have been an active member since. We are honored to have such an incredible event tonight. We have the author Anna showcasing her father's experience during the Shoah. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box. And as we move along, and then at the end, we'll answer all of your questions with Anna. And from here, I want to introduce my dear friend, Rachel Schnee, who is the YLA co-chair. And she's going to introduce the author of the book, Anna. And we're so incredibly lucky to have everyone here tonight. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Dana. This is such an exciting event. We've been wanting to do this for a few months now. And if you haven't read the book, it's okay, because Anna's going to give a whole presentation and it's incredible. But the book is incredible. I did read it and I loved it. I think it's so fascinating to read the perspective of a second generation and also a little bit of like third generation and how she was raised, you know, a little bit different than some other survivor families that grew up kind of with a lot of survivors around them. And it was really fascinating to hear her story and her parents' story, who happen to be my cousins. Anna's actually my dad's first cousin, my grandmother and Anna's mother, Ruth, who recently passed away, Zichrono Levarcha, were sisters. So this is especially meaningful and special for me to read a book that's about my family, and for her to have done such extensive research. It's really unbelievable. I'm just going to give you a little bit of background of Anna. Anna Salton Eisen is my cousin and the child of 2 Holocaust survivors. She lives in Texas, where she was a founding member and the first president of Congregation Beth Israel in Colleyville, Texas, where her rabbi and friends were held hostage in January. She has conducted extensive research into the Holocaust and spoken on this topic to schools and community groups throughout the country. She served as a docent for the Dallas Memorial Center for Holocaust Studies, now called the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, and conducted Holocaust survivor interviews for the USC's Shoah Foundation. Anna is an ambassador to hashtag Every Name Counts, a digital initiative of the Arlson Archives, I hope I pronounced that right? The world's most comprehensive archive on the victims and survivors of Nazi persecution. In addition to co-authoring 2 Holocaust books, Anna is executive producer of an upcoming documentary film based on the 2 books and her father's story. Wow, I'm so excited about that. A licensed social worker, Anna formally practiced as a therapist specializing in mental health and trauma. So we are so honored to have Anna here, and she's going to give an presentation, and I'm so excited. So I'm going to hand it over to her.
Great, thank you. Thank you everybody for tuning in. I didn't know I'd be competing with Ken Burns, but I'm glad to be here and share my story. I hope everyone can see the screen. So yes, as Rachel said, my experience was different. I grew up and my parents, like some other Holocaust survivors, really didn't talk about the Holocaust. I really didn't know anything about it. I was born in upstate New York, and when I was about 5, we moved to the Maryland suburbs when my father started his career at the Pentagon. And I noticed that, yes, you know, my parents were different. They had thick foreign accents. We had no photographs of relatives in the house, and pretty much we had no relatives on my father's side of the family. But, you know, I was a child and I heard little bits and pieces about the war or camps, and kind of knew not to ask questions because I would see a look of anguish on my father's face. But when we moved to Maryland and I was about 8 years old, I was in one of the dens looking for some playing cards, and I reached my hand into a side table drawer and pulled out 2 watercolor paintings. They were really shocking and quite frightening. I mean, here I was about 8 years old, and I'd never seen anything like this in a storybook or in a school book. But clearly there was this frightening image of people and soldiers, buildings on fire. And a second painting that was equally disturbing and frightening of a young man kneeling before a pit that was, filled with some kind of bloodied bodies. And, there were people in the background wearing these yellow stars. And they were signed by a name I didn't know, L. Salzman. So I put them away and kept my father's and family secrets. I really didn't say anything, but I started to hear a little bit and started to, go to the school library and look in books. And, I even found a black and white photo of bodies being bulldozed. And I wondered, is this the secret? Is this my family? I remember once talking to one of my little friends when I was about 10 and saying, my father was in a camp and all my relatives died in this war in a gas chamber. And not long after, her mother pulled me aside and said, don't ever talk about these things again. So soon I had my secrets and my father had his secrets. And it was just kind of a house of sorrow and questions. And I just lived that way until I moved to Texas. When I was engaged and I moved to Texas, when I was 25 years old, I came and discovered that there was a Holocaust museum. So I went in there and learned everything and actually became a docent and then started interviewing Holocaust survivors for the Shoah Foundation. And it was during one of these interviews that I realized that I didn't want some stranger asking my father his story. I wanted it to be me. So I confronted him and told him that all I knew about the grandmother I was named after was that she died in a gas chamber, and that wasn't enough. So I confronted him and said, can we go to Poland? And he, being the loving, generous, sweet man, said, of course. So 2 weeks later, the entire family was on a plane, and we would be going back to Poland to learn not just his family history, but the Jewish history of what happened during the Holocaust. So many of you may have been to these places, to Auschwitz, and I just have a few pictures. The one with the ladder is something that really stayed with me because I never really had imagined that the barracks were made of stone and bricks. And here was a ladder that someone had built for some poor prisoners to climb into a bunk. And I couldn't even imagine how terribly freezing and cold and hard the life was for those that were lucky enough to stay alive. There are these synagogues all over Poland, like this one here, that is empty and barren. And inside, my parents are sitting with my brother, and they have these cutouts of what Jews used to look like. So standing in these empty synagogues, desecrated cemeteries was really painful to me, but it also brought home what was the truth of our history. Even more disturbing in some of the markets, I found trinkets like these, little wooden figurines of what Jews used to look like. Jews with prayer books, Jews with musical instruments, and even Jews carrying little bags and coins, feeding into, the prejudice and the stereotypes that still persist to this day. We returned to my father's town, and here on the top, that yellow building, my father is standing in front of his elementary school. In the middle, in front of one of the Christian homes where he had friends who at times were helpful and some friends at times turned against them. And even though my father said, no matter what, I don't want to go into my house, we were walking down the street and my mother was quite talkative and gregarious. And before we knew it, we ran into an older woman who was so excited. And here we were walking into my father's home, where I went and I stood in my grandmother's kitchen. I went with my brother and searched the attic in a desperate attempt to find anything, but there was nothing there. But I did learn, especially coming back and on the journey, about who my father was. My father was Lucjan Salzman. He was the artist who painted those scary watercolor paintings that I had found as a child. Here is one photograph that we have of his family that was sent to a relative who had managed to get out at the beginning of the war. My grandmother, Anna, who I'm named after, my grandfather, Herman, my father as a baby, less than a year old, and his older brother, Monik, who was 6 years older and who did not survive. My father later returned again to his drawings, and here I'll share with you, interspersed in these, is how he remembered. This is his town, Tichin. It was a small town. His family was fairly secular, but you can see children playing in the street and religious Jews. But then in September 1939, they were occupied by the Germans. Everything changed. The Nuremberg laws and restrictions. My grandfather, who was an attorney, could no longer work. They had curfews. They had to turn in their radios. They couldn't have weapons. They couldn't have typewriters. Even under the Nuremberg laws, Jews couldn't have pets. Women were forced to be humiliated. Here you see them wearing the white armband and scrubbing the streets. And this is how my father remembered it. They desecrated the synagogue and brought the Torahs out into the street, where they set them on fire. And then the Jews of Tichin were forced, like Jews from many, many other communities around their towns, to relocate to Rzeszów, where there would be a ghetto, where 23,000 Jews would be forced to live in very cramped areas, suffering great brutality and hunger, deprivation, and very, very deadly conditions. Once they were there in the Rzeszów ghetto, the entire ghetto would be liquidated at the beginning of July 1942. All the Jews would be sent on boxcars to Belzec, where they were all gassed. And it was just a mere, 20 miles away from the town. My father and 465 other Jewish young men were separated and kept in a smaller part of the ghetto, where they will be working as slave labor for Daimler-Benz. Daimler-Benz had taken over a factory to make aircraft munitions, and they did not have enough Polish workers. So at the time, before the SS took over, Daimler-Benz was allowed to take the small group of young Jewish men, including my father, and keep them behind while everyone else was murdered. And this is the story of my father being part of the 465, as they were called, the Daimler-Benz Jews. The first camp he was in out of 10 camps in Germany, Poland, and France was Rzeszów, but the name was changed to Reichshof as the Germans came and Germanized all the Polish names. Here he remembers working, and even though he was only 14, he had to sweep the streets and eventually become trained to be a lathe operator so that he would be of value and be kept alive. But at some point, the SS took over and said no more Jews. So this group of 465 Jews were shipped out. Although many scholars today, I've read many books about these Daimler-Benz during the Third Reich, no one had any idea what happened to them. The assumption is that they were all gassed, but they weren't. Daimler-Benz sent them from there, first to Płaszów, the camp known from Schindler's List, where my father and other prisoners worked with their bare hands to dig up graves because the camp was built on 2 former Jewish cemeteries. From Płaszów, they went to Wieliczka, where he labored in the salt mines pictured here. From Wieliczka, he was sent to Flossenburg, which was a stone quarry. And here my father was forced to strip and stay naked for 2 weeks during the quarantine. And this was the time where he lost the small packet of any photographs that he had of his family. And from Flossenburg, after working in the stone quarries, and I want to point out here that in my father's artwork, he often included personal references. So when you look at the prisoner on the far left, who's bent over with a shovel, he is wearing my father's Flossenburg prisoner number. From Flossenburg, they were sent to France. There was an abandoned tunnel that had been set up and discarded, and the Nazis came in and moved the factory equipment into the tunnel, which you can see the opening here. And inside, there still stands today this painted phrase on the wall that says, "Here worked 462 Jews from Poland," because initially 3 had died. But soon the Allies were approaching, and they were forced again to move from the camp in France. Now they would be sent, just like from every camp, in the boxcars, these long, terrible rides where many, many people died, and they were sent back into Germany, first into Sachsenhausen. Here he writes about and draws this experience that he remembers. This was like a torture that they carried on, where they would take, in this case, it was French resistance prisoners, and they had this T on their head that stands for Tod, which means death in German. And all day they were forced to march in circles and shackles. And at the end of every day, one prisoner was selected to be hung, and they never knew who it would be. And this has been shared with Sachsenhausen because this is a very unique story. And again, it is a story not about, Jewish prisoners, but other prisoners who also suffered at the hands of the Nazis. From Sachsenhausen, they went to a camp called Wattenstadt, pictured here. These are all original photos. And again, the Germans did not want to set them free. Even though the war was starting to turn against them, they knew that they needed to still have slave labor in order to keep up their war effort. From Wattenstadt, you can see here in his art, the same thing pretty much he describes in many of the camps. The roll calls, the selections, the beatings, the hunger, the terrible conditions that he had to live as a boy who was only from 14 to 17. And from there, he went to Braunschweig, another camp in Germany. And I'm going to give you a spoiler alert that Rachel Schnee's grandfather, Simcha Horowitz, who was in Auschwitz for a while, at one point was sent to Braunschweig. And from the rest of the war, he was with my father and liberated with my father. And we'll never know, because they never had this conversation, because they didn't talk about it, whether they actually knew each other, because they were together for a great part of the war and together on that wonderful day of liberation. From Braunschweig, and here you can see again, I've just shown you some of my father's art. Now I will say, my father did all of these drawings in 2008, and all of them were donated and are now part of the permanent collection at Yad Vashem in Israel. From there, they were sent to Ravensbrück. Now, Ravensbrück was primarily a women's camp, but there was a small sub-camp for male prisoners. This is one of the only times during the Holocaust that Jews were allowed to get any Red Cross rations. At this point, the war was almost ending, and a group of diplomats came from Sweden with packages trying to negotiate for the release of some prisoners. Well, of course, that didn't happen, but for some reason or another, there was a German officer who allowed my father and that group to go and get some rations. And my father got some cigarettes, some powdered cheese, some crackers, and this helped him stay alive. And this has been well documented in many other books. From Ravensbrück, and here he draws, you can see, the prisoners were already dying. There was no work. There was hardly any food. And, and there were women standing outside the wire because it was a women's camp. They were sent to the last camp, Webelen. Webelen was a sub-camp of Neuengamme, located in northern Germany. It was only open 10 weeks and was not finished. There was no windows, no doors, and you can see here that the barracks weren't even finished. There were no shelves. The prisoners slept on the dirt floor, and over a period of only 10 weeks, 1,000 prisoners died. There was only one water pump in the camp, and there was basically no food. On May 1st in the evening, all the prisoners were put into boxcars, not knowing where they were possibly going, but the boxcars did not leave. There is much speculation, were the tracks blown up? Did the locomotive not arrive? But on the next morning, on May 2nd, 1945, the American soldiers arrived, and my father and Rachel's grandfather were liberated. This is my father here on second from the right, that was taken by an American soldier who was there. He was actually there as a medic, but he also had a camera. And I recently just connected with him, and he was telling me the story about when his grandfather, who was an American soldier, came into this camp. He put down everything and picked up the camera to document this. And that is my father, second from the right. He was in a displaced persons camp in Neustadt, which was in the British zone, for 2 years. And then when he was 19, in 1947, he finally was able to get a hold of the one relative in New York and go to the United States. And so here you can see he drew a little picture. He went from Bremen in Germany on the USS Marine Flasher, and there's a picture of him on the boat coming to America. In the United States, he was drafted, and he served as a soldier in the United States Army, and he only had a 5th grade education. But he met my mother, who was a survivor, and using the GI Bill, he went from 5th grade to college, where he got a bachelor's in physics and a master's in engineering, and then had a career at the Pentagon. After the trip to Poland, he finally was really starting to speak, and he kind of went from being a victim to a survivor. When people would come up and say, "Thank you for inspiring me. Thank you for sharing your story. It's so important to know." And this is a copy of the new 20th anniversary edition of his book, which is coming out on September 27th. I think it just came out in Kindle, but he traveled all over the country. And, you know, I just feel like many other children of survivors or scholars that it's up to us to preserve the truth and keep the story alive. There were some really incredible things that happened when his book came out. Our publisher wanted to use the picture of him at Liberation, but they needed to see it. So I sent them this book that my father had gotten from the Pentagon War Library called The Devil in Baggy Pants, a pictorial history of the 82nd Airborne, the 504th. And in it, the permissions editor found her father. He had never spoken about the Holocaust. And then when he wanted to, he had a stroke and couldn't speak. And he died without ever sharing the story. But he had passed down to his one son the Nazi flag that he had cut down from the camp, and he shared it in the parking lot. Here you can see my father holding the flag. In Texas, in Colleyville, 5 minutes from me, I heard about this Lieutenant Colonel James McGillis, called Maggie, who was the most highly decorated veteran of the 82nd Airborne. He's actually up now for the Medal of Honor. And he was one of the 7 soldiers who liberated my father. So I met him and introduced my father. In this picture here, they went together back to the Veblen camp, courtesy of the German government, where they had met across the barbed wire to lay a wreath. And I will share that 2 weeks ago, there was a story in the Washington Post and all over the press that I flew to DC because of COVID. Maggie, who I last saw when he was 101, died 2 years ago, but he finally had his funeral with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. So I was invited, and I know the family, and I knew that my father would want me to go and pay respects to this great American hero. My father passed away in 2016, and I took on the mantle to keep the story alive and take over for him, speak in schools and all over, and just tell the story so it just does not fall into an abyss of silence. I started doing some research with the Arlson Archives, and I looked at my father and I found these incredible records. Here you see my father on an original Ravensbrück prisoner list with his date of birth, January 7th, 1928, from Przemysl, Poland. Here, the original Flossenburg list, Lucjan Salzman, prisoner number 160109. Here, from Natzweiler in France, in such beautiful handwriting, it's quite shocking, another prisoner number, but my father's original camp records. And I started searching through the archives and putting this together because being a child of survivor and taking on this responsibility is more than just telling the story as I know it. It's continuing to learn, to research, to grow, to know, because the history is only beginning to be uncovered as all these records are being digitized and shared, with Yad Vashem and many other repositories. I found his ID card post-war that listed all 10 camps and all of his prisoner numbers. And here, in my own searches, which I have spent hours doing, I found the original bread list from the Veblen camp from the day he was liberated. And it goes through the end of April and then May 1st. And then on May 2nd, the column is blank because that is the day they didn't get bread, but they tasted freedom. And I learned a lot more. I learned more that I hadn't learned from my father, that on May 1st, when those other prisoners couldn't leave and they came out on May 2nd, where were those trains going? Those trains were going to Lübeck Bay, all of the camps that were part of Neuengamme. And at Lübeck Bay, all the prisoners were loaded onto 2 ships that were mistakenly fired upon by the British, and more than 6,000 prisoners died. They either drowned or were burned to death or shot fleeing to shore on May 3rd. My father, another miracle, somehow was saved along with Reishi Schnee's grandfather and liberated on that day, May 2nd, which also happens to be my birthday. When my father died and my mother came to live with me, I found in the possessions these little photographs of people that he had exchanged photos in the displaced person camps and my father's concentration camp pass and a diary. When I went to Poland, my father spoke about these friends, Moses Zimmern, Itzik Rip, Moses Hofstetter, Tobias Newson. And in fact, they're all written about in his memoir. But now they had faces and they became real people to me, real young men that had been with my father from the ghetto through 10 concentration camps and liberated together. So I went back to the archives and started searching. And amazingly, I found this, a list original saying 465 Hafling, Jewish prisoners from Reichshof, with my father's name and number. I went back and looked again and found his friends, found their numbers, found their dates of birth, found their towns. And I found that there were 7 of them that he had written about. And I went on a wild hunt to try and track them down, or if they were no longer living, to find their families. And I did. I found 7 of them. Here with my son, we had a reunion in New Jersey. I didn't go into the lobby because I thought it would be too emotional. And of course, it was. And we zoomed in with the other families from Sweden, from Israel, from Texas. And it was the first time that we had met, except for one of us. And none of them really knew their father's story. Many of the men had died very young, in their early 40s, when their children were little, of, various kinds of cancer. Who knows what kind of conditions they had been exposed to in the camps. And many of them, the fathers just never spoke about it because it was too painful. One person here said, I found my father on page 86. Another childhood survivor read the book 5 times, and she said, your father is telling me my family history. And here we were, the children and those on Zoom, and we had made this bond. And I remember once my father said in his speech, I never would have imagined, none of us together, that one day people would come together free from fear, just open and from their heart, and learn about what happened to us and care. Never would he have imagined that the children of all of his friends, who all saved each other's lives countless times, would become friends ourselves. And so after Poland, I wrote my memoir because I didn't know what to do with these stories. And I knew that if I kept it a secret because it was difficult, that it wasn't the right thing. This picture is one of my most cherished. It is my father and my son on another trip to Poland, walking in step through Majdanek. And it's cherished to me because I know they are having a conversation that my father couldn't have with me when I was that age. And so it was getting passed down through the generations. And here's my son below, as we're working on this documentary film that's going to be released in a few months. Our goal is to make a film that will appeal to young people, that will be creative, that will be visual. We have animation, original music scores, something different to try and capture the hearts and the minds of the new generations that learn in a very different way. And here's
early in the last century, a government of a large and civilized country in Central Europe has decided that the segment of its population was less than human.
I remember just rummaging through one of the end tables looking for some playing cards, and I came across 2 old watercolor paintings of horrific scenes that I could not have even imagined. And they were signed by someone named L. Salzman.
And consequently, they could be denied access to education, that could be denied opportunity to work, they could be arrested, they could be beaten.
He wanted a family that replaced the family he lost. And he wanted that feeling of security.
I just really felt the need. I felt compelled to try and find out who my father really was. Who was this Lucjan Salzman?
And I will say about the film, it's really amazing because the animators did 3D models of my father's town and the buildings, the artist. There is an original score. So this is not the trailer, it's a teaser because the sound engineer, until they're done, we have Polish voice actors, they don't call it a trailer, but I just wanted to share a little bit of what they're doing with the art and the animation. The young boy looking at the big house, that actually was my grandparents' house that I've been into. and everything has been really authenticated. So who was my father? I mean, my father was Lucjan Salzman. And I think when you look here and you see the drawing and his photograph taken right after liberation, once his hair had grown in, there's no doubt that in some ways he was trying to really share his story and tell his story to us. A little bit about my mother. She just passed away in July. She was 100 years old. She was also a survivor, and along with Rachel's grandmother and another sister and brother and family, they fled from Tomashev Lubelsky across to the Soviet zone and were able to be in Russia and the Soviet Union during the Holocaust. And then after the war, she returned back to Chechen in Poland, where many different groups from Israel had come to set up kibbutz, and she was recruited to be in the Bricha as part of the drawer movement. And so, you know, I didn't know till a few years ago what her real name was. It's not Ruth Wolfberg, which is what her papers say, a Jew from Berlin. She was never from Berlin. Her name was Sima Nickelsberg. And this picture on the top is her in Chechen, and that is her wearing the plaid jacket, the one from the left. And when I just met with a historian from Yad Vashem, she said the tall guy with the wild hair is actually Abba Kovner. And we have pictures with her, with many people who were also in the resistance. And the picture below, you see my mother standing there with her cape. And these are some of the children that she helped rescue. After the war, she would go to convents and go to farms and towns, and they would collect the Jewish children. 85% of the Jewish children in Europe were murdered. My father tells a story when they were in Israel at one time. Someone came up and recognized her and said, "You led us through the Alps." She was in Czechoslovakia, in Italy, in Poland, and in Germany. And these pictures and many pictures are also on the site at Yad Vashem at the US Holocaust Museum. And the picture of her here was taken the night before her 100th birthday. It was 6 days from when my rabbi was held hostage. And she said, "If you don't take me to services, I'm going to walk." She was tough. And that night she went and stood with a rabbi, and he said, "Ruth, tonight we're both survivors." And so, as you may, have heard about what happened at my synagogue with the hostage situation. And I will say that, I started the synagogue after I came back from Poland, and I said, I've been to Poland where there's synagogues and no Jews, and I live in Texas where there's Jews and no synagogue. And so, but I was in charge of the renovation, and a few days, 3 days after the hostage taking, when I went into the building and it was empty and silent and cold and bullet holes in the stained glass, the carpet was bloodied, the whole place had to be redone. It just reminded me of Poland and how I had felt. But this time, we just said, we are not defeated and we will not be afraid. And so after this, I also had the opportunity to go and be a guest at the confirmation hearing of Deborah Lipstadt. And I continue to find new ways to collaborate with schools, with the Tennessee and Texas Holocaust Commission, with churches, being part of anti-Semitism studies. And, I think Holocaust education, as the UN says, Holocaust denial is anti-Semitism. And so we're trying to find a way to battle distortion, denial, and anti-Semitism. And hopefully the film, the books, and just going and speaking will help be, just a small wave in the big ocean of the work that we have to do. And that is my brief story. So thank you for letting me share it. And now I guess I'll turn it back to the hosts and any questions you might have.
Wow, Anna, thank you so much for this incredible insight into your life and into who your family and your father is. I don't know about anyone else. I'm sure I had goosebumps all over my body the entire time. Wow, thank you.
When is the film coming out?
The film is coming out when it's ready, probably in the next few months. There's I didn't know anything about filmmaking, and I still don't know much about filmmaking, but we're at the point now in editing and sound engineering. And then what happens is they put it all together. It's feature length. We may have to go back and do some more voice narration to kind of pull it together. But apparently there's the process, and it's going to be before the end of the year. And then we will go through whatever the channels are to get it into distribution and get it to film festivals and all of that. But, you know, I know the creative process, so I'm not pressuring the filmmaker. I'm saying, I'd rather you take a few extra weeks and be really happy with it than try and make a deadline. So, but coming soon.
Do we have any questions from the listeners? Yes, go ahead.
Me? Hi.
Sure.
So
Yeah,
I'm in Los Angeles. Sorry, I'm in my car because I was like driving from event to event. I want to say I read your book, Pillar of Salt, and I underlined so many sentences. I'm also the daughter of survivors, and there were so many things that I'm not going to go into now because now I guess I wanted to ask you a bigger question. Actually, two things. Can I share that my dad
Sure.
was 86 when he started speaking about the Holocaust? His name is Joshua. He's from Hungary. He was in Auschwitz, Birkenau on the death march to Dachau, and then in a subcamp called Muldorf. I think Muldorf and Flussburg, they like transferred things from Flossenburg to Muldorf, the cement factory for the, anyway, he only started speaking at the age of 86. And then he really wanted a picture to show what he looked like in his blue and white striped pajamas, but he didn't have one. I wish I could have reached out to your dad and say like, can you sketch? We found someone on Venice Boulevard. Anyway, to make a long story short, I'm in awe of the books that you produced, of your memoir, of the story. And I'm just wondering what advice you would give to someone like me. I'm second generation. I haven't done anything really with, I've voice recorded and I've written, but what advice would you give to someone putting out a book, interested in possibly telling a story or a memoir? And like, how long did the process, I imagine both books were very different processes for you. So maybe if you could speak about the process of the first book and the second book.
My father's book, you know, I was there when I confronted him, and he was like, I am Adam, you know, nothing came before me. And I was like, not true. And I got out a legal pad and said, okay, how do you spell Sachsenhausen? And he just said, oh, forget it. So he said, I'll write it down. And he came back with 600 pages. So I went through the editing, but through the editing and on the phone, new stories kept coming out, or I would say, I can't see my grandmother, describe her. And so that was a real collaboration. The publisher from University of Wisconsin Press in 2014 started his own independent press with other academics. He had been the head of press at Wayne State, Syracuse, Indiana, Bloomington. And so the Pillar of Salt was just me writing. And so my advice to you is just write, try and be open. You might cry a lot, that's okay. And then when you're ready and you have it typed up and in a PDF, send me an email and I'll send it to my publisher. I promise you a reading. And then the process is not hard at all. They have an editor, they make some things, they spell check you, you know, just tell your story. And if it's a good story, like the film, if we have a good film, then it will find a place. But
Okay,
you just
to
have
be continued.
open.
I might reach out to you because I don't want to take up too much time.
Yeah,
And
reach
I
out to me. If you go
Okay,
to the
thank you so much.
website, and someone can maybe put it in the chat, annasaltoneisen.com, it's got all the historical documents, all the art. The art is all shareable, downloadable. It's being developed into PowerPoints for schools, for the state of Texas. Everything is shareable. But my email is on there, and please reach out. Where do you live in? Are you in Los Angeles?
Yeah.
You should go meet the mayor of Beverly Hills, because I haven't met her, but she's also a child of survivors, and we've connected through social media. So you never know who she knows. And
Okay. Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you.
Sure.
And everyone to put this together. I'm looking forward to the next book. I'm going to now get the other book, the 23. Yeah.
Do we have more
any
questions?
other?
I have a question for you. Are you able to share in some ways how your identity was shaped by growing up under the shadow of Holocaust survivors?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, up until the time I was like 18 and I went to college, I just really didn't understand or didn't know about it. And when I would go to visit Rachel's family in New York, they were all partisans. So they were different. You know, they were proud, they had fought, they carried themselves differently. But for my father, who was, 14 to 17 and a victim and his whole family murdered, it was not something that he could speak about. And I can say that because I'm also a licensed therapist and have worked in patient psych and in trauma. But even at 18, I had my first hostage situation. The Hanafi Muslims took over the B'nai B'rith house and held over 100 people hostage. In 1977, I was standing outside and made the national news with a sign that said never again. Of course, now I realize no one probably knew what that meant because there was no Holocaust museum, no Steven Spielberg yet. It was just in the earliest days. But I think that for 30 years, I've been doing this. The books are just another vehicle, but I've spoken in schools. I've spoken out at schools. I mean, my children went to South Lake schools where there was the whole publicity about teaching an alternative view of the Holocaust. I now live in the Keller School District where Anne Frank was, quasi-banned and all of that happened. My rabbi was held hostage. And so it's just really affected me in a lot of ways to start a synagogue, to be involved with the Holocaust museums, with the Anti-Defamation League, and just I just really feel like I don't want to be quiet anymore. Living in the Bible Belt at times has been difficult, and it is getting to be difficult again. I just took part in an anti-Semitism survey, so I think it has affected me, but in a positive way. That if I can make a difference and help in all way preserve this history, because I think when it falls into the hands of other people, then we can't control how they're going to distort it, deny it, or change even how the history is told. Like we see right now in a lot of countries that are, fighting, any idea that they were collaborators themselves.
Thank you. We do have another question from Carol, who is listening as well. She said, do you have any further knowledge of your father's parents and your father's brother? And were you able to find documentation of their fate?
So my father's parents and all of his aunts and uncles, he had a tremendous family, all went to Belzec and they were all gassed, along with everybody from all those towns, from all over, from Galicia, from Kalisz, and all different places, from Rzeszów now, where the 82nd Airborne is there today, restationed, helping Ukraine. As far as my father's brother, they were supposed to meet in the United States after the war, and he was older and he never showed up. So my father assumed that he had died. But while my father was alive, I found a list on Yad Vashem of Jews from Tichin who had survived the Holocaust, and I found his brother's name. This was in 1946, and I found also his joint distribution ID card. Then I went back into the archives of the Shoah Foundation and found a man who lived in Chicago, and in his testimony, I found that he had been with my uncle, my father's brother, who had escaped the camp and was with the partisans in the woods. And he testified that after the war, him and his two brothers and my uncle had gone back to a small town in Poland looking for an infant who had been left with a Christian family. And when they tried to claim the infant, my father's brother was shot and killed. Not only am I in touch with his family, but that little infant is now a grown woman, and I am in touch with her. And she knows this story too. So my father, did learn of this. And even though, it was heartbreaking to hear, at least he took solace in the fact that his brother was liberated and did get to taste, freedom. And, that's the best that we can do. So there's still so many stories to be uncovered. There's still so much to be learned. We just have to do the looking.
Wow.
Any other questions or?
We did.
Can
Go
I
ahead.
just say something? Hi, Anne. It's Gabby Schnee. Hi. You see me?
Hi, so Gabby, yes, I see you, beautiful Gabby, blonde
Mm.
Barbie. So her father and my father were together in several camps and liberated together.
I can't tell you how amazing this is. Really, you
Yes.
did so much research, and I'm crying. This is amazing, really.
Well, I'm crying because the fact that your father and my father were together, and there's a chance they were together for a while. And so, you know, there weren't that many at that last Camp Veblen, there were not very many Jews.
It's
There were
unbelievable.
Dutch and Norwegians and other prisoners. So the fact that they could have been together, you know, sharing a piece of bread, you know, holding each other up. And there are, I will tell you, I will send it to you. This Son of the Soldier has an entire file of photographs taken on the day of liberation at Veblen. And there is a good chance that I'm going to send them that you may find a picture of your father.
Oh my!
We need to see that.
Thank
I
you,
will,
Anne, for
I will email you
everything.
the file.
This is amazing. Thank you, really.
You are very welcome.
Yeah, and you are goals. This is like unbelievable. I hope to do this one day. It's you're gonna have to help me.
I will help you. The people from the Arlson Archives are really, really helpful. You know, I have to give credit to them in Germany. They have the, you know, a penal code, no swastikas, no anti-Semitism. They're really the model for taking the experience, and what they have done with the archives, the records that are available, how helpful they are. The collaboration with Yad Vashem is just really amazing. And this has got to be the path forward, that we preserve and that we search. There are millions of records that are still not digitized.
Wow.
Incredible. And I do want to read some of the comments that that we are getting for you. Let's see. Not really questions, but thank you for your poignant presentation. Your in-depth research is admirable. I'm a second generation, and your book has very much resonated. Thank you for writing and sharing. You're so lucky your father was still alive to open up about his past. I wasn't so lucky, but it's wonderful to piece everything together. Not a question, just a comment. Seeing your father's name on the lists of the camps was so impactful. Thank you so much for sharing your story and your motivation for your work. I am also a 2G born in a DP camp who has published research and is an active Holocaust education today. I was inspired by your work.
Thank you, thank you. And thank you to every Holocaust educator. They are so important, and anything we can do to help them, inspire them. I've been to Tennessee, to school districts where there are no Jews, no synagogues, and they raised money on their own and took 35 high school students to Auschwitz. They bring in a survivor. They have 2,000 people come. So it's really, you know, we have to know and have our hearts lifted that this does matter. There are people who really care and are working very hard to bring this into curriculum, into the state mandates, and you know, the work of the next generation. I'm still waiting for someone, maybe Yad Vashem. We need a gathering of the second generation to get together. I don't think that's taken place yet, an international gathering. So maybe Rachel will be in charge of that.
I would definitely do that. Yes. Second and third, I guess, you know.
Second and third.
Yeah.
Do we have any more questions for Anna? Anna, I want to thank you sincerely from the bottom of my heart, I'm sure as everyone else, for sharing your story, this moving event, your book. And it is up to us, it is up to the next generation to share these stories, to share not just a story, but a name, make it more personal so that we all never forget and this never happens again. It's our responsibility now. So I appreciate you taking the torch from your parents and sharing it with us, and may all of us do the same. I do want to just let everyone know that if you want to get more involved in the American Society for Yad Vashem, please reach out to Donna. We are always looking for new people. Donna has shared her contact I have been a part of this, like I said in the introduction, for about 4 years, and it has truly impacted my life and changed so many aspects, from where I live to some of the friends that I've made. And I do want to let everyone know that our next book club is November 16th at noon. It's at 12 p.m. And it's going to be with the TikTok sensation, Dove Foreman, joining us from the UK to discuss the book Lily's Promise that he co-authored with his great-grandmother, Lily. So any questions you have, you can reach out to me, to Rachie, to Donna, to Miriam. I think Donna shared her contact in here. And again, Anna, what an incredible opportunity you've given all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. And anyone, feel free to contact me. I'm speaking at high schools and doing webinars for every high school in San Antonio, Texas, and going to Beaumont and going to libraries. So if you have any schools or synagogues, I don't ask for any money, and I'm happy to share the story. So just put people in touch with me, and we'll keep going till I'm 89, like my dad, when he last spoke, was 89. So
Thank you so much, Anna.
all right, thank you.
Thank
Good night.
Good night. Bye.